Resentment is a thin, treacherous shadow that creeps into the soul when expectations shatter against reality. It is born the moment we feel injustice, betrayal, or a lack of recognition. At first, it's a slight sting, barely noticeable, but over time it can turn into an oppressive weight if you give it power over yourself. The development of resentment is like a dialogue with oneself frozen in time. We replay the situation in our heads over and over, mentally adding new details, intensifying it, and adding color. We imagine how we could have answered differently, how those around us should have acted, how the world was obligated to fold in our favor. Resentment feeds on our reflections, grows, and occupies the space of the soul, turning into bitterness. As Sigmund Freud said, unexpressed emotions never die, they are buried alive and manifest later in uglier ways. Resentment is a complex emotional state that affects several levels of human life at once: biological, psychological, and spiritual. It can be a fleeting reaction or a deep wound that leaves a mark on the consciousness for years. Why do we feel resentful? How does resentment affect the body? Is it possible to get rid of it? The answers to these questions lie at the intersection of science, psychology, and philosophy. Of course, spiritual teachings offer their own answers as well. From a neurophysiological perspective, resentment is a complex process involving the activation of the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is responsible for the emotional response, including feelings of threat and injustice. The hippocampus records memories and creates links between unpleasant events and emotional pain. The prefrontal cortex, in turn, participates in the rational understanding of the situation and decision-making. But with strong resentment, its influence weakens and emotions begin to dominate, making sound judgment impossible. Research shows that prolonged experiences of resentment increase levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which can lead to chronic tension, anxiety, and even health problems. When we experience resentment, our brain reacts as if it has encountered a threat. This isn't just a metaphor. Studies show that the emotional pain caused by resentment activates the same areas of the brain as physical trauma. Primarily, the limbic system is engaged, especially the amygdala. It handles the processing of emotionally significant events and instantly flags the situation as potentially dangerous. If resentment becomes chronic, the amygdala remains in constant tension, raising the overall level of anxiety. The anterior cingulate cortex, a brain region associated with processing pain, also plays a key role. One study showed that emotional rejection activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. This is exactly why resentment can literally feel like a blow to the soul. But resentment isn't just about brain function, it involves hormonal changes too. When a person is resentful, cortisol is released into the blood. This leads to increased blood pressure, a weakened immune system, and general fatigue. Conversely, levels of oxytocin, the hormone of trust and attachment, decrease, making the person more withdrawn and distrustful. Thus, resentment is not just an emotion, but a complex biochemical process that can have long-term effects on health. As neurobiologist Joe Dispenza wrote, our thoughts literally change the chemical composition of our brain, forming either new opportunities or reinforcing old traumas. Psychological research shows that chronic resentment can become the basis for developing psychosomatic illnesses, such as hypertension, migraines, and gastrointestinal issues. Dr. Hans Selye, who studied stress, wrote, "He who cannot forgive constantly poisons his own nervous system." Resentment can also lead to social isolation. A person fixated on their grievances begins to project negative experiences onto others, which destroys relationships. From a scientific standpoint, it's clear that resentment is a stress response. But why do some people get offended easily and for a long time, while others are able to let go of unpleasant moments quickly? The answer lies in the psychological structure of the personality. Psychologists note that resentment is tied to expectations. We expect certain behavior, respect, gratitude, or support from others. When reality doesn't match these expectations, a sense of injustice arises. For example, if a person considers themselves a caring friend but receives indifference in return, they may feel deep resentment. Mikhail Litvak, a well-known psychotherapist, said, "Resentment is aggression turned inward. It destroys the one who carries it, not the one it is directed at." In other words, the resentful person punishes themselves first and foremost. Constantly returning to an unpleasant situation reinforces negative emotions, creating a vicious cycle. The psychological structure of resentment includes several aspects: the cognitive beliefs like "I was betrayed" and the interpretation of situations; the emotional aspect, anger, pain, disappointment; the physiological, body tension, high blood pressure, insomnia; and the social aspect, the reinforcement of resentment by one's surroundings. For example, when people encourage a victim mentality, it is important to understand that resentment doesn't always have a purely emotional character. It can be manipulative. Sometimes people use it to get attention or to trigger guilt in others. This internal conflict between the desire to let go and the drive to hold on to the pain is irresolvable until we realize that resentment is a choice. Yes, we might have been hurt, but do we continue to carry this pain within us? That depends only on whom, on the person themselves. It often seems that by holding on to resentment, we are protecting ourselves, preventing the world from hurting us again. But in reality, these are just chains we throw over our own freedom. In literature and philosophy, resentment has always been seen as a dual emotion. Dostoevsky showed in his works how resentment can grow into revenge and destroy a person's character. In the novel The Idiot, one of the characters observes that resentment is a poison that a person drinks themselves, hoping it will poison the other. Marcus Aurelius, on the other hand, argued, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. In this, you have the power to revoke at any moment." Psychologists say that resentment is not just an emotion, but an entire system of beliefs in which we play the role of the victim. And the longer we stay in that role, the harder it is to get out. But how do we overcome resentment? Forgiveness is not an excuse for the offender's actions, but a release of the weight from oneself. Research shows that the practice of forgiveness lowers cortisol levels and promotes the production of serotonin, the happiness hormone. Dr. Fred Luskin, author of Forgive for Good, asserts, forgiveness is not a gift to another person. It is a release of oneself. Then, what else can there be? Acceptance. This is the realization that the world is imperfect, and people are not obligated to meet our expectations. Reframing is the opportunity to see the situation from a different side, from many sides, to understand what this pain might have taught us. As Nelson Mandela said, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping it will kill your enemies. And finally, gratitude is the alternative to resentment. Instead of focusing on what we lost or didn't get, we can turn our attention to what we have and what we've gained, what wisdom. Gratitude gives us the strength to look at the situation differently, not as an injustice, but as a lesson. Perhaps resentment helped us realize our own value, set boundaries, or see people in their true light. If so, then it was also useful to us. So, resentment can be both destructive and valuable. The main thing is not to let it stay in your heart for too long. After all, ultimately, freedom from resentment is, again, a choice. If science and psychology explain how resentment forms and how to work with it, spiritual traditions offer paths to total liberation from it. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Sufism all agree that resentment is a state tied to an attachment to the ego. Buddhists believe that suffering arises from a wrong perception of reality. Resentment is an attachment to a false expectation that the world will conform to our desires. The Christian tradition emphasizes the importance of forgiveness as a way to cleanse the soul. The Bible says, If you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Forgiveness here is understood not as an excuse for others' actions, but as freeing oneself from a destructive emotion. In Islam, resentment is seen as a trial requiring wisdom, patience, and a willingness to forgive. The Prophet Muhammad taught that he who forgives receives a greater blessing than he who holds a grudge. Ultimately, forgiveness cleanses the heart and brings a person closer to the Almighty. Sufi sages say that resentment is a signal of internal problems. Rumi wrote, "When you are wounded by a word or an act, ask yourself which part of you is suffering. That is the part you have yet to free yourself from." Sufis suggest looking at resentment not as a problem, but as an opportunity for self-discovery. If we look at resentment as a phenomenon, it includes 4 aspects. What makes the resentment significant? Experience, expectation, identity. How it forms, beliefs, emotions, physiology. How it affects behavior, fixation, aggression, avoidance, and how it can be changed. Awareness. Changing interpretation, forgiveness practices. A person can emerge from a state of resentment if they recognize its mechanism and begin working on its transformation. This requires mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and an internal readiness to accept reality as it is. And here is the key point. You can't do it without reflection. For a transformation of resentment into gratitude to occur, there must be a transformation related to self-identification. If the structure managing me is the personality, which is, in turn, a collection of social programs and connections, then the chances of completely removing resentment, like other negative and destructive programs, are 0. Resentment is hardwired into the way the personality exists. It is a necessary part of social bonds and relationships. As strange as it may sound, it is an important social tool that regulates behavioral norms, unites groups, forms identity, and motivates change. While it can lead to conflicts, overall, resentment helps society develop by establishing boundaries of what is acceptable and maintaining order. All of this happens, as you might guess, at the social level. At the spiritual level, resentment is an obstacle on the path to one's own self-unfolding, which only a subject can overcome. The subject is the next level of human development as a whole, from biology to personality, from personality to subject. The movement happens at the point of self-awareness. Thus, resentment is not just an emotion, but a complex phenomenon affecting different levels of life. It influences our brain, body, behavior, and spiritual state. However, resentment is not inevitable. It can be recognized, analyzed, and transformed. Scientific research shows that working with emotions lowers stress levels and improves health. Psychology offers techniques for cognitive reprocessing of resentment. And spiritual teachings remind us that the ability to forgive makes a person free. Ultimately, the choice remains with everyone: to hold on to resentment and suffer, or to free yourself from it and move on.